The quantum scanner's persistent beeping had become the soundtrack to Dr. David Reeves' morning routine, a technological alarm clock that refused to acknowledge his desperate need for caffeine. He squinted at the holographic display floating above his workstation, the blue-green symbols dancing like drunken fireflies in the dim light of the research pod. The energy readings from Sector 7 had spiked again overnight, climbing to levels that made his equipment practically vibrate with excitement. "Well, at least someone's having a good time," he muttered to the scanner, tapping its side with the universal scientific gesture of percussive maintenance. The device responded by producing an even more frantic series of beeps, as if protesting his casual violence. Kepler 442b wasn't supposed to be interesting. When David had signed up for this xenoarchaeological expedition, the recruitment officer had sold it as a routine survey of potentially significant pre-contact ruins. What she hadn't mentioned was that potentially significant apparently meant readings so bizarre they made senior researchers nervous and junior researchers reach for stronger coffee. David belonged firmly in the latter category. The crystalline structures they discovered 3 weeks ago defied every conventional understanding of alien architecture. They weren't built so much as grown, spiraling up from the planet's surface like frozen music made manifest. The largest formation stretched nearly 2 kilometers into the thin atmosphere, its translucent walls pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that followed no discernible rhythm. His colleagues had dubbed them the resonant spires, though David privately thought they looked more like someone had asked a coral reef to design a skyscraper after a particularly wild night out. He pulled on his environmental suit with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned that fumbling with life support systems was rarely amusing. The suit's AI greeted him with its usual cheerful optimism, a voice that sounded like it had been programmed by someone who'd never experienced a Monday morning. "Good morning, Dr. Reeves. Today's forecast calls for scattered crystalline formations with a chance of unprecedented scientific discovery. Thanks, Annie. Any chance you could dial down the enthusiasm to a level that won't make my hangover worse? I'm detecting no evidence of alcohol consumption in your recent biometric data, Dr. Reeves. It's a metaphorical hangover. From dealing with impossible physics all week." The AI paused, processing this concept with the kind of literal-mindedness that made David wonder if artificial intelligence was really all it was cracked up to be. "Shall I adjust my personality matrix to reflect a more cynical worldview?" "God, no. I need at least one of us to stay optimistic." The airlock cycled with a hiss that always reminded David of his grandmother's pressure cooker, complete with the accompanying anxiety about whether something might explode. Kepler 442b's surface greeted him with its usual alien hospitality, a landscape that looked like someone had taken Earth's most beautiful desert and run it through a kaleidoscope filter. The twin suns cast everything in shades of amber and rose gold, while the crystalline spires caught the light and threw it back in brilliant cascades of refracted rainbows. David's scanner immediately began having what could only be described as an electronic seizure. The energy readings were off the charts, literally. The display kept trying to recalibrate itself to accommodate numbers that shouldn't have been possible. He'd seen similar readings from active fusion reactors, but these structures had been dormant for millennia. Or at least, they were supposed to be dormant. "Annie, you're seeing this too, right? Please tell me my equipment isn't having a breakdown. All instruments are functioning within normal parameters, Dr. Reeves. The energy signatures appear to be genuine, though I must note they exceed my theoretical models by approximately 4,000%. 4,000%. Right. Just another Tuesday on the exciting frontier of xenoarchaeology." He approached the nearest spire with the careful reverence of someone who'd learned that alien artifacts had a tendency to respond poorly to human skepticism. The crystalline wall rose before him like a frozen waterfall, its surface covered in patterns that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. The scanner's readings intensified as he drew closer, the quantum fluctuations creating interference patterns that made his teeth ache. That's when he noticed the shadow. It wasn't the normal kind of shadow that followed predictable rules about light sources and solid objects. This shadow moved independently, flowing across the crystal surface like liquid darkness. David froze, his scientific curiosity warring with the more primitive part of his brain that suggested running away might be the better part of valor. The shadow detached itself from the spire's surface, resolving into a figure that shouldn't have been possible. Humanoid in basic shape, but covered in what appeared to be some kind of adaptive camouflage technology that bent light around its edges. The figure stood motionless for a moment, and David had the unsettling impression that he was being studied with the same intensity he'd been applying to the ruins. "Well," he said to his scanner, as if the device might offer moral support, "this is either the most important first contact in human history, or I'm about to become a very interesting footnote in someone else's research paper." The figure tilted its head slightly, a gesture so recognizably human that David felt a ridiculous surge of relief. At least whatever this was, it seemed familiar with the concept of curiosity. The camouflage technology rippled and shifted, revealing glimpses of what looked like advanced armor beneath, sleek, organic curves that suggested technology far beyond anything in humanity's current arsenal. David raised his hands slowly, hoping that the universal gesture of, "Please don't vaporize me," transcended species barriers. The figure remained motionless, but something in its posture suggested watchful attention rather than immediate hostility. "I don't suppose you speak Standard Galactic?" David asked, then immediately felt foolish. Standard Galactic was a human construct, developed for theoretical first contact scenarios. The chances of an actual alien species having independently developed the same linguistic framework were approximately zero. The figure moved then, a fluid motion that brought it several steps closer. David's scanner nearly vibrated out of his hands as the energy reading spiked again, and he realized that whatever technology this being possessed was interacting directly with the spire's energy matrix. The crystalline walls around them began to pulse with renewed bioluminescence, patterns of light racing up toward the structure's apex like neural impulses in some vast artificial brain. "Okay, that's either really good or really bad," David muttered. "In my experience, ancient alien technology coming to life is usually followed by exciting developments like dimensional rifts or accidental time travel." The figure paused again, and David could have sworn he detected something like amusement in its posture. It raised one hand, definitely a hand, though encased in technology that made it look more like an extension of the armor itself, and pointed directly at David's scanner. The message was clear enough: the device was causing interference. David looked down at his scanner, then back at the figure. "You want me to turn it off? But this is my only way of understanding what's happening here. Without it, I'm just a confused primate poking at things I don't comprehend." The figure's head tilted again, this time in what David interpreted as patient expectation. "Right. Trust exercise. Sure. What could possibly go wrong with trusting mysterious alien technology?" He powered down the scanner, and the immediate silence was almost deafening. Without the constant electronic chatter, he could hear the subtle harmonics emanating from the spire itself. A deep, thrumming resonance that seemed to vibrate through his bones. The bioluminescent patterns in the crystal walls shifted to a slower, more rhythmic pulse, like a vast heartbeat. The figure stepped closer, close enough that David could make out details of the armor's construction. It wasn't manufactured in any conventional sense. The material seemed to flow and adapt like living tissue, adjusting its configuration in real time. Whoever was inside had access to technology that made human engineering look like stone knives and bearskins. The figure gestured toward the spire's base, where David now noticed a section of the crystal wall that was slightly different from the rest. The patterns there were more complex, forming intricate geometric designs that hurt to look at directly. "You want me to examine that section?" David asked, feeling increasingly like he was playing the universe's most consequential game of charades. The figure nodded, another reassuringly human gesture, and moved to stand beside the indicated area. Up close, David could see that the patterns weren't just decorative. They were functional, part of some kind of interface system that responded to proximity and intention rather than physical manipulation. "I don't suppose this comes with an instruction manual?" he asked, but reached out toward the crystal surface anyway. The moment his hand made contact, the world exploded into light and sensation. Not painful, but overwhelming, like trying to drink from a fire hose made of pure information. Images flashed through his mind, vast cities that defied gravity, beings of impossible beauty moving through gardens of crystallized starlight, technologies that treated the fundamental forces of physics like art supplies. And through it all, a sense of profound loss. Whatever civilization had created these spires was gone, leaving behind only their monuments and their guardians. David jerked his hand back, gasping. The figure beside him remained motionless, but he sensed a subtle shift in its attention, from watchful wariness to something that might have been cautious interest. "That was intense," he managed. "I'm guessing you've been here a while, haven't you? Watching over all this?" The figure didn't respond, but David had the impression that his words had struck home. He looked around at the towering spires, at the play of alien sunlight through impossible crystal formations, and felt the weight of centuries pressing down on him. "Must get lonely," he said quietly. 3 weeks of playing xenoarchaeological 20 questions with his mysterious companion had taught David several important lessons. First, that patience was apparently a virtue he'd never properly cultivated. Second, that trying to communicate complex scientific concepts through interpretive dance made him look like he was having some kind of medical emergency. And third, that whoever was inside that adaptive armor had either the tolerance of a saint or a sense of humor dry enough to make a desert jealous. "I'm telling you, the quantum resonance patterns suggest a harmonic amplification system," David explained to the figure he'd taken to calling Sentinel, gesturing wildly at his tablet display. The armored being stood perfectly still, head tilted in that now familiar pose of polite attention that David had learned meant either, "Fascinating, please continue," or, "This human has finally lost what remained of his sanity." Sentinel raised one hand and made a gesture that David had tentatively interpreted as either, "You're completely wrong," or, "Please stop before you hurt yourself." The universal language of scientific collaboration, apparently, was more universal than he'd hoped. "Look, I know it sounds crazy, but hear me out. If these spires are designed to channel ambient energy from the planet's magnetic field, then the crystalline matrix would need to be calibrated to specific frequencies. And the only way to maintain that calibration across geological timescales would be through some kind of active monitoring system." Sentinel moved to the nearest crystal formation and placed a gloved hand against its surface. Immediately, the bioluminescent patterns began to shift, reorganizing themselves into configurations that made David's quantum scanner have what could only be described as electronic heart palpitations. "Right," David said, watching the readings spike beyond anything his equipment was designed to measure. "I'm going to take that as, you're overthinking this, human." The patterns in the crystal wall coalesced into something that looked almost like a schematic diagram, though one rendered in living light rather than static lines. David squinted at it, trying to parse what appeared to be a three-dimensional representation of the entire spire complex, complete with energy flow indicators and what might have been structural stress analyses. "That's either a technical manual or the most elaborate way of saying, you missed the point, in the history of interspecies communication." Sentinel's helmet turned toward him, and David swore he could feel amusement radiating from behind the adaptive camouflage faceplate. Over the past few weeks, he'd become surprisingly good at reading his companion's body language, despite never having seen so much as a glimpse of what lay beneath the armor. "Annie," he said to his suit's AI, "are you recording all this? Because I have a feeling my thesis advisor is going to want some pretty compelling evidence when I try to explain why my research methodology involved interpretive crystal gazing with a possibly mythical alien guardian. All interactions are being logged, Dr. Reeves. Though I should note that your thesis advisor specifically requested that you avoid any incidents that might result in interdimensional warfare or accidental time paradoxes. She's very particular about footnote formatting too. Real stickler for academic protocol." Sentinel had moved on to another section of the crystal wall, where the patterns were more complex and seemed to pulse in rhythm with something David couldn't quite identify. His scanner was picking up electromagnetic fluctuations that followed no recognizable pattern, as if the crystal itself was thinking. "You know," David said, settling down on a convenient chunk of crystallized mineral, most people would consider this the discovery of a lifetime. First contact with an obviously advanced alien civilization, evidence of technology that makes our best efforts look like finger painting, ruins that could rewrite our understanding of physics. I should be composing my Nobel Prize acceptance speech right about now. Sentinel paused in whatever technical wizardry they were performing and turned to look at him. Instead, I'm sitting on an alien rock, talking to someone who might or might not understand a word I'm saying, trying to figure out whether these crystals are ancient computers or really elaborate mood rings. The armored figure approached and sat down beside him with a grace that suggested either extensive martial arts training or bones that operated on entirely different principles than human anatomy. Up close, David could see that the armor wasn't just adaptive camouflage, it was actively repairing microscopic damage, smoothing out scratches and realigning components with the fluid efficiency of living tissue. Self-repairing nanotechnology, David observed. Either you've got the most advanced materials science in the galaxy, or you're actually some kind of shape-shifting space wizard. Please tell me it's the nanotechnology. I've had enough reality-challenging experiences this month to last several academic careers. Sentinel reached into what David had learned was some kind of dimensional storage compartment, because apparently conventional pockets were for species that hadn't figured out how to fold spacetime like origami. And produced a device that looked like a crystalline tuning fork crossed with a particularly ambitious kaleidoscope. The device hummed when Sentinel activated it, producing harmonics that made the nearby crystal walls respond with cascading light patterns. Within moments, the entire chamber was alive with bioluminescent communication, streams of data flowing through the crystalline matrix like thoughts through neural pathways. "That's beautiful," David said, and meant it. The light patterns weren't just functional, they were elegant, artistic, expressing concepts that human language didn't have words for. It's like watching music made visible. Sentinel turned the device toward David, and suddenly he could feel the harmonics resonating through his body. Not painfully, but with a strange sense of connectivity, as if the crystal network was trying to include him in its vast conversation. Images began to form in his mind, not the overwhelming flood he'd experienced the first time, but gentle impressions. He saw the spires as they had been in their prime, surrounded by gardens that existed in dimensions human eyes couldn't perceive. Beings of impossible grace moved through spaces that folded and unfolded according to need rather than geometry. And he saw the guardians, figures like Sentinel, though their armor gleamed with different configurations, different purposes. They weren't just protectors of the ruins. They were the living memory of their civilization, carrying within themselves the accumulated knowledge of millennia. You're not just guarding these sites, David realized. You are the sites. The real treasure isn't in the crystals or the technology, it's in you. Sentinel deactivated the device, and the vision faded, leaving David with the lingering impression of vast loneliness and unimaginable responsibility. "How long?" he asked quietly. "How long have you been alone here?" Sentinel stood and moved to the chamber's center, where the largest crystal formation rose like a frozen fountain toward the ceiling. They placed both hands against its surface, and the entire structure began to resonate with deep, mournful harmonics that seemed to echo through David's bones. The light patterns that emerged told a story David wished he couldn't understand. The gradual fading of the great cities, the slow retreat to the most sacred sites, the final vigil as the last of their kind chose to become guardians rather than let their civilization's memory die with them. "I'm sorry," David said, and was surprised by how inadequate the words felt. "I'm sorry you've been carrying all this alone." Sentinel's helmet turned toward him, and for a moment, David thought he saw a flicker of something almost human in the armor's adaptive camouflage. A brief glimpse of features that suggested emotions he could recognize. Then the moment passed, and Sentinel was once again the inscrutable guardian, keeper of mysteries that predated human civilization by eons. But something had changed. The quality of attention, the subtle shift in posture that suggested David was no longer just a curious intruder to be tolerated, but perhaps something more. A witness. A friend, even, in whatever way such concepts translated across the gulf between species. "Well," David said, standing and brushing crystalline dust off his environmental suit. "I don't know about you, but all this profound interspecies communication has worked up an appetite. I don't suppose you've ever tried human field rations? Because I have to warn you, they're considered a violation of several interplanetary treaties governing cruel and unusual punishment." Sentinel's helmet tilted in that familiar gesture of amused patience, and David grinned inside his helmet. Some things, apparently, were universal, including the fundamental truth that friendship often began with shared suffering over terrible food. The emergency beacon's shrill alarm cut through the morning air like a chainsaw through a symphony, jolting David from his contemplation of Sentinel's latest technological demonstration. His companion had been showing him how the crystal matrices could be reconfigured to channel different types of energy. A process that involved hand gestures so elegant they made David feel like he was watching poetry written in physics. "That's not my equipment," David said, checking his scanner. "Someone else is broadcasting on the emergency frequency." Sentinel's posture shifted immediately from patient teacher to something far more predatory. The adaptive camouflage rippled across their armor, cycling through patterns that made David's eyes water if he looked directly at them. "Probably just another research team," David continued, though something in Sentinel's sudden stillness made his stomach clench. "The university was planning to send additional personnel once I filed my preliminary reports." The beacon's signal intensified, accompanied by the unmistakable whine of heavy atmospheric craft approaching fast. David's environmental suit automatically adjusted its audio filters, but he could already hear the thunder of engines that belonged to something much larger than a research vessel. "David Reeves, this is Captain Morrison of the Kepler Mining Consortium. We have a legal salvage claim on this sector. Prepare for immediate evacuation." David stared at his communicator as if it had just announced its intention to become a professional dancer. "Salvage claim? This is an active archaeological site under university protection. Your protection order expired yesterday, Dr. Reeves. Check your legal databases." "Annie," David said to his suit's AI, "please tell me Morrison is suffering from some kind of bureaucratic delusion." "I'm afraid not, Dr. Reeves. The university's emergency funding was cut 3 days ago. Without active financial backing, the archaeological protection status automatically lapsed." 3 days ago? Why wasn't I informed?" "You were. The notification was flagged as low priority by your email filters because it contained the words, administrative review, and budget allocation restructuring." David closed his eyes and counted to 10 in 3 different languages, including one he'd invented specifically for occasions when the universe decided to demonstrate its sense of humor. "So because I have my email set to filter out academic bureaucracy, I missed the notice that my life's work is about to be strip-mined by corporate pirates." That is a succinct and accurate summary, yes. The first mining ship crested the horizon like a mechanical mountain, its hull bristling with extraction equipment that could reduce the crystalline spires to component molecules in a matter of hours. Behind it came 2 more vessels, their cargo holds already open and waiting to receive whatever treasures they could rip from the ancient structures. Sentinel had gone completely motionless, their camouflage now cycling through patterns that David had learned meant extreme agitation. The nearest crystal spire began to pulse with warning colors, deep reds and violent purples that made the air itself seem to vibrate with barely contained energy. "This is not good," David muttered. "Sentinel, I need you to stay calm. These people don't understand what they're dealing with. If you start glowing and making the crystals angry, they're going to interpret that as a threat." Sentinel's helmet turned toward him, and David caught a glimpse of something that might have been incredulous disbelief radiating from behind the faceplate. "Right, I know. Asking someone to stay calm while watching their sacred sites get desecrated by corporate looters probably ranks somewhere between insensitive and grounds for justifiable homicide on the interpersonal relations scale." The lead mining ship touched down with all the grace of a falling refrigerator, its landing thrusters scorching the delicate crystalline formations that had taken millennia to grow. Captain Morrison emerged from the airlock wearing the kind of environmental suit that suggested its wearer expected to encounter significant resistance, both environmental and otherwise. Dr. Reeves. Morrison's voice boomed across the landscape with the artificial heartiness of someone who'd learned his people skills from corporate training videos. Glad to see you're still in one piece. We were worried when you didn't respond to our evacuation notice. Probably because it's hard to evacuate from a place that's supposed to be under legal protection, David replied, walking toward the mining team with what he hoped was academic authority rather than barely controlled panic. Morrison's laugh had the sincerity of a politician's campaign promise. Legal protection that your own university couldn't afford to maintain. Don't blame us for picking up the slack. You're not picking up slack. You're committing xenocide. Strong words, Doc. But last I checked, xenocide requires actual aliens. All I see here are some pretty rocks and a lot of untapped mineral wealth. David gestured toward the spires, which were now pulsing with increasingly agitated bioluminescence. Those pretty rocks are active technology. This entire site is a functioning system left behind by an advanced alien civilization. Sure it is. Morrison signaled to his team, who began unloading extraction equipment with the efficiency of professional vandals. And I suppose you've got little green men hiding in the crystals too? Actually, they're more of a translucent silver, and technically they're not hiding so much as, Dr. Reeves. Morrison's voice had taken on the patience of someone explaining basic physics to a particularly slow child. I understand you've been out here alone for weeks. Isolation can play tricks on the mind. Makes people see things that aren't there, hear voices in the wind. Perfectly natural psychological response. The only thing playing tricks here is your legal department, David shot back. These sites are protected under the Galactic Heritage Preservation Act. Even if the university's funding lapsed, the cultural protection clauses would, could. Lawyer talk, document. The bottom line is we've got legal salvage rights, and you've got about 10 minutes to pack up your gear before we start mining. That's when Sentinel decided to make their entrance. The adaptive camouflage dropped away like a discarded cloak, revealing the full magnificence of their armor in direct sunlight. The mining team's casual confidence evaporated as they found themselves facing something that belonged in their nightmares rather than their quarterly profit reports. Holy, Morrison's voice cracked like a teenager asking someone to prom. Language, Captain, David said mildly. We're in the presence of a guardian of one of the galaxy's most ancient civilizations. Try to show some respect. Sentinel stepped forward with predatory grace, and the crystal spires responded to their presence like a symphony orchestra receiving a conductor's cue. Light cascaded through the crystalline matrix, patterns of energy that made the air itself sing with harmonics that human ears could barely process. This is impossible, Morrison whispered, his corporate bravado crumbling like a cheap suit in a thunderstorm. Yeah, well, get in line, David replied. I've been rearranging my understanding of possible on a daily basis for the past month. The mining team had their weapons out now, though David noted with some satisfaction that their hands were shaking badly enough to make accurate aim unlikely. Sentinel regarded the armed humans with the kind of attention a librarian might give to patrons who'd started a food fight in the poetry section. Dar. Reeves, Morrison said, his voice now carrying the tremor of someone whose worldview was undergoing rapid and unwelcome revision. What exactly are we dealing with here? Well, Captain, that depends entirely on your intentions. If you're here to study and preserve these sites, then you're dealing with the most knowledgeable guide in the galaxy. If you're here to strip mine sacred monuments for profit, then you're dealing with someone who's been protecting these places since before your species learned to make fire. Sentinel raised one hand, and the crystal spires began to resonate with a deep, thrumming harmony that made David's teeth ache. The mining equipment, all of it, simultaneously, began to malfunction in ways that defied troubleshooting manuals. Display screens flickered and died, extraction arms seized in mid-motion, and the massive cargo holds sealed themselves with the finality of bank vaults. This is a violation of salvage law. Morrison protested, though his heart clearly wasn't in it anymore. I think, David said, watching as Sentinel's armor began to glow with bioluminescent patterns that matched the crystal spires. You'll find that salvage law has some interesting exemptions when it comes to sites that are actively defended by their original owners. The harmonic resonance intensified, and suddenly David could feel the vast network of crystal formations extending deep into the planet's crust, not just monuments, but a living system that connected this world's entire ecosystem. The mining team wasn't just threatening a few pretty structures, they were about to perform surgery on a planetary nervous system with chainsaws. "Gentlemen," David said with the kind of calm that comes from watching the universe rearrange itself around principles you're only beginning to understand, "I strongly suggest you reconsider your business plan." The mining team's hasty retreat left behind only scorch marks and the lingering smell of burnt electronics. David watched their ships disappear beyond the horizon, trailing smoke, and what he suspected was the sound of Captain Morrison explaining to his corporate superiors why their quarterly profit projections had just been revised by a factor of completely impossible. "Well," David said to Sentinel, who stood beside him like a monument to the universe's capacity for surprise, "that was significantly more exciting than my usual Tuesday. Though I have to admit, watching grown men flee in terror from advanced alien technology never gets old." Sentinel's helmet turned toward him, and David caught what might have been amusement in their posture. The crystal spires around them had settled back into their normal patterns of gentle bioluminescence, though David noticed they maintained a subtle harmonic resonance that suggested they were still very much awake and paying attention. "I suppose this means I need to make some calls," David continued, pulling out his communication device. "The university's legal department is going to love explaining to the Galactic Mining Authority why their salvage claim was voided by what the insurance companies will probably classify as acts of ancient alien intervention." Annie's voice crackled through his suit speakers with barely contained electronic glee. "Dr. Reeves, I've been monitoring corporate communication channels. The mining consortium is currently describing the incident as equipment failure due to unprecedented electromagnetic interference. They appear to be avoiding any mention of sentient alien guardians in their official reports. Probably wise. Nothing destroys a company's stock value like admitting their extraction team was outmaneuvered by someone who predates their entire civilization by several geological epochs." Sentinel had moved to the largest crystal spire and placed both hands against its surface. The patterns of light that emerged were different from anything David had seen before, more complex, more personal. They seemed to be carrying on a conversation with the crystalline network, sharing information in ways that made human language look like finger painting. "You're telling them what happened, aren't you?" David asked. "Making sure the whole network knows that the threat has passed, at least for now." Sentinel nodded, then gestured for David to approach. When he placed his hand on the crystal surface, the familiar rush of sensation flooded through him, but this time it felt different. Less overwhelming, more welcoming. The network recognized him now, accepted him as something more than just another curious primate poking at things beyond his comprehension. Images flowed through his mind. The vast crystalline networks that connected not just this world but dozens of others, a civilization that had learned to think on geological timescales and build monuments that could survive the rise and fall of stars. And at the heart of it all, the guardians who had chosen to become living repositories of their people's memory rather than let it fade into cosmic background radiation. "It's not just about protecting the sites," David realized. "You're keeping their entire culture alive. Every story, every scientific discovery, every work of art, it's all preserved in you." Sentinel stepped back from the crystal and faced him directly. For a long moment, they stood motionless, and David had the sense of being evaluated by something vast and ancient and infinitely patient. Then Sentinel spoke. "You are different." The words came out in accented but perfectly clear human speech, and David nearly dropped his scanner in surprise. After weeks of gesture-based communication and interpretive crystal gazing, hearing his companion's voice felt like discovering that the universe had been hiding a fundamental law of physics in small print. "You can talk," David said, then immediately felt stupid for stating the obvious. "I mean, you've been able to talk this whole time, and you let me spend 3 weeks doing what probably looked like the worst mime performance in galactic history." Your efforts were educational. Sentinel's voice carried a warmth that the armor's intimidating appearance had concealed. Definitely feminine, though with harmonics that suggested vocal cords designed for a wider range than human speech could produce. Educational. Right. I'm sure watching me try to explain quantum mechanics through interpretive dance was deeply enlightening. It was endearing. David felt his cheeks warm inside his helmet and was grateful for the environmental suit's opacity. So why now? Why reveal that you can speak human languages? Sentinel gestured toward the retreating mining ships, now barely visible as dots on the horizon. Because you defended what was not yours to defend. Because you saw value in preservation over profit. Because in 6 billion years of watching, I have rarely encountered beings who choose wonder over wealth. She moved toward a smaller crystal formation that David had always thought looked like a frozen garden, its delicate structures branching and flowering in patterns that seemed to shift with the light. When she touched it, the crystals began to glow with soft, warm radiance that made the entire chamber feel alive. This was my garden, she said quietly. Before the ending, before the choice, I cultivated thought flowers here. Concepts that grew like living things, ideas that bloomed into new realities. You chose to become a guardian. To give up your own life to preserve theirs. We all chose. When the final darkness came, when we realized our time was ending, we faced the question all civilizations must eventually face: how do we ensure that what we were will not be forgotten? David looked around at the crystal spires reaching toward alien stars, at the bioluminescent patterns that carried the accumulated wisdom of eons, at the impossible technology that treated physics like a rough draft rather than immutable law. You became living libraries. Living museums. You embedded yourselves into these sites so that your culture could survive even after your people were gone. And now, Sentinel said, her voice carrying centuries of loneliness, I am the last. The final guardian of the final garden on the final world where we chose to make our stand against oblivion. The weight of that revelation settled on David like a gravitational field. He was looking at the last representative of a civilization that had reached heights humanity couldn't even imagine, someone who had voluntarily accepted an eternity of solitude to preserve the memory of her people. That's why you tested me, he said. Why you watched me for weeks before revealing yourself. You needed to know if I could be trusted with that knowledge. I needed to know if you could be trusted with more than knowledge. She turned to face him directly, and David saw her hands move to the sides of her helmet. His breath caught as he realized what she was about to do. I have guarded these sites for 6,000 years, she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of eons. I have watched empires rise and fall, seen species emerge from primordial oceans and reach for the stars. I have been alone with only the memory of my people for company. The helmet's adaptive camouflage began to fade, revealing features that were breathtakingly, impossibly beautiful. Human in every way except for the elegant, elongated ears that marked her alien heritage. Her eyes held depths that spoke of centuries of accumulated wisdom and sorrow, but also something else, hope, fragile and new. But with you, she continued, for the first time in millennia, I have not felt alone. David stared at her face, drinking in features that belonged in classical sculptures but animated by intelligence that had witnessed the birth and death of civilizations. When she smiled, tentatively, hopefully, he felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of what was possible. Well, he said, his voice only slightly unsteady, I was expecting tentacles. She laughed then, a sound like crystal bells and starlight, and the entire garden responded to her joy. The thought flowers bloomed with renewed radiance, concepts taking shape in living light around them. Your sense of humor, she said, is either your greatest weakness or your greatest strength. I prefer to think of it as a survival mechanism. When you're faced with the impossible, sometimes the only sane response is to make inappropriate jokes. Then we are well matched, she said, her smile transforming her ancient features into something young and alive. For I have spent 6,000 years learning that laughter is the one thing that remains beautiful even in the face of ending. David reached out, hesitating for a moment before gently touching her face. Her skin was warm, real, wonderfully solid despite the impossibility of her existence. "So what happens now?" he asked. "I mean, I assume the university is going to want a full report, and I'm not sure, I fell in love with the last guardian of an ancient alien civilization, is going to fit into their standard paperwork. Now," she said, leaning into his touch, "we write a new story. One that has never been told before." Around them, the crystal garden pulsed with patterns of light that seemed to echo with the music of creation itself, and David realized that some discoveries were worth more than all the academic recognition in the galaxy.